Boston, 1942. The war had brought rationing, sacrifice, and uncertainty, but that Saturday night felt different. The city pulsed with music and relief. Soldiers on leave filled the Cocoanut Grove nightclub, where palm leaf decorations and blue lights promised escape from the world's darkness. Laughter mingled with jazz as couples danced under the artificial stars, unaware that the room itself was a trap waiting to close. A careless spark touched the fabric ceiling, and in seconds the celebration turned to chaos. Flames leapt upward, feeding on paint and plastic. The air thickened with poison. People ran toward the exits, but the doors were locked. The famous revolving door jammed tight with bodies as smoke swallowed the bandstand. Those who fell never rose again. Outside, sirens pierced the cold November air. Firemen fought through a storm of heat and screams. Within 15 minutes, joy had turned into an inferno that would take nearly 500 lives. Boston woke the next morning to a silence so deep it felt like the city itself was mourning. 80 years later, the ashes of the Cocoanut Grove still whisper lessons about greed, negligence, and the cost of human complacency. This is not just the story of a fire, it is the story of a night when safety was forgotten, and a nation learned too late that a locked door can turn celebration into tragedy. The night was meant to be ordinary, a celebration after a football victory, a rare evening of laughter during wartime. Yet decades later, the few who survived the Cocoanut Grove still speak of it in fragments, as if the memory itself resists being told. Among them was a young nurse named Eleanor, who had gone dancing with friends. Her voice, recorded years later, trembles through the crackle of an old tape. I remember someone shouting fire, but nobody moved. They thought it was part of the show. At first, she said, the music didn't stop. The band played on, unaware that the ceiling above the stage had begun to glow. Then came the smell, sweet, chemical, almost pleasant before it turned suffocating. People laughed nervously, waving their hands at the smoke. Someone tried to reach the exit, only to find it blocked by tables. Panic came not as a scream but as a slow realization that there was nowhere to go. Outside, firefighter Daniel Keating was polishing his engine when the alarm rang. He remembered the sky turning a strange orange before they even reached the scene. It wasn't fire, he said later. It was a roar, like the city itself was burning. When his crew forced their way through the main door, heat struck like a hammer. The walls were slick with soot and sweat. People were still standing, motionless, already gone where they stood. Keating's men worked until their boots melted, dragging bodies through shattered glass, calling out names that no one answered. In another part of the city, a mother named Helen Mullen was preparing for bed when the radio interrupted its regular broadcast. She froze as the announcer's voice broke, naming the Cocoanut Grove. Her daughter, a waitress at the club, had promised to come home by midnight. Helen ran into the cold without a coat, joining hundreds who gathered behind police lines. The smell of burned fabric and hair filled the air. For hours, the crowd stood in silence, waiting for names that never came. Doctors and nurses from nearby hospitals worked through the night. Ambulances brought the living and the lost in waves. The corridors became fields of agony, men in tuxedos, women in evening gowns, all unrecognizable under the burns. Medical students fainted at the sight. The living begged for water, their voices too weak to rise above the sirens. In the chaos, Eleanor was brought in among them. She later recalled the sound of shoes melting onto the floor and the steady ticking of a wall clock that somehow survived the fire. When morning came, the city was unrecognizable. Frost covered the sidewalks, and the smoke hung low like mourning cloth. Families moved from hospital to hospital, searching faces that no longer resembled the ones they loved. At the morgue, lines stretched for blocks. Reporters described the scene as a city of widows, but even their words could not capture the silence that followed. For the firefighters, the nightmare never ended. Keating kept his uniform from that night in a box until his death. The cuffs were blackened, the badge warped from heat. Every time I closed my eyes, he said years later, I'd see them reaching out. Survivors lived with similar ghosts. Some avoided crowds forever, others refused to enter any room without checking the exits first. The fire had not only burned flesh, it had branded memory. Historians often begin with the facts, 492 dead, over 1,000 injured, cause determined to be a match. But before numbers and reports, there were these voices. The laughter that became screaming, the mothers who never stopped searching, the firefighters who never forgave themselves for being too late. Their testimonies are not just records, they are echoes of a night when an entire city held its breath and never truly exhaled again. The story of the Cocoanut Grove does not belong to history books alone. It belongs to the men and women who walked into a nightclub and vanished into smoke, leaving behind only the words of those who lived long enough to remember. The night of November 28, 1942, began with victory. Boston College had lost its long-awaited football game that afternoon, and the mood across the city was mixed, some disappointed, others merely relieved to have something to distract them from the war. The Cocoanut Grove nightclub in Bay Village, however, promised no disappointment. It was the most glamorous place in town, a fantasy of tropical escape in the middle of a bitter New England winter. By 7 o'clock, the first guests began to arrive, wrapped in wool coats and good cheer. They came to drink, to dance, to feel human again after another week of war headlines and rationing. The Grove was a haven, and on that night, it overflowed with more than 1,000 people, far beyond its legal capacity of 460. Inside, the club glowed like a dream. The main room was an imitation jungle, its ceiling hung with palm fronds made of satin cloth, its walls lined with mirrors and bamboo trim. The floor was polished to a shine, reflecting the swirling lights from the bandstand. Couples squeezed around tables no bigger than dinner plates, laughing as waiters slid between them carrying trays of cocktails and champagne. The smell of rum, perfume, and cigarette smoke filled the air. Musicians tuned their instruments on the small stage beneath the glass ceiling of the Melody Lounge, the lower-level bar famous for its intimacy and its air of forbidden excitement. It was a night for forgetting, for pretending that the world outside didn't exist. The owner, Barnett Wolanski, sat near the entrance surrounded by friends and politicians. A man of influence and arrogance, he had designed the club to impress, not to protect. Exits were few and hidden. The main revolving door, decorated with gold trim, was the centerpiece, meant to look grand, not practical. Other doors were locked to prevent people from slipping out without paying. The windows were sealed to keep the atmosphere intact. Every inch of the Grove was designed for illusion. The palms were fake, the stars painted, the smiles rehearsed. Around 10 o'clock, the crowd thickened. Soldiers danced with nurses, and couples leaned across tables, whispering above the noise. The orchestra struck up another swing number, and the floor rippled with movement. In the basement lounge, a young busboy named Stanley was struggling to change a light bulb near one of the decorative palm fronds. The bulb refused to screw in properly. Someone joked that he should light a match to see what he was doing. He did. For a second, the tiny flame illuminated the glossy fabric above his head. Then, with a hiss like breath through paper, the ceiling caught fire. It started small, a single glowing thread crawling across the cloth. Several patrons noticed but didn't react. One man laughed and said, "They're adding special effects." Within moments, the fire raced along the ceiling like lightning through dry grass. The air shimmered, the lights flickered, and a strange stillness filled the room as confusion replaced joy. Then the first scream broke the spell. The crowd surged toward the stairs that led to the main floor, but the staircase itself had become a chimney, funneling the smoke upward faster than anyone could move. Upstairs, the orchestra continued to play, unaware of the inferno rising beneath them. When the lights suddenly went out, panic ignited. The first wave of smoke burst from the stairwell, rolling across the ceiling like a living thing. A waitress tried to lead people toward the revolving door, shouting for calm, but within seconds the entrance became a crush of bodies. The door jammed under the weight of dozens pushing from behind, trapping those in front. People clawed at one another, screaming for air, for space, for mercy. The music had stopped, replaced by the roar of fire and human desperation. In the kitchen, cooks dropped their pans and ran toward the back exits, only to find them bolted shut. Someone tried to break through with a chair, but the thick metal latch held firm. In another corner, a bartender smashed bottles against the wall, using the wet towels to cover his mouth as he crawled toward a service corridor. The smoke was black, choking, heavy with chemicals from the synthetic decorations. Many didn't make it past a few breaths. Outside, on Piedmont Street, the first signs of disaster appeared. A man stumbled through the revolving door, his clothes burning. Another collapsed just behind him, clutching his chest. Within moments, the doorway became a funnel of smoke, and the orange glow inside was visible from the street. Pedestrians shouted for help. Someone ran to the nearby fire alarm box, pulling the lever that would send the first call to the station. Firefighter Daniel Keating was among the first to respond. From several blocks away, he saw the reflection of flames dancing against the windows of parked cars. As his truck approached, the heat hit like a furnace. People were pouring out of side alleys, some half-dressed, others barefoot, their faces blackened with soot. He later said that it was the only fire where he could smell death before he saw it. By the time the engines arrived, the building was a torch. The decorative canopy above the entrance had collapsed, spreading flames across the sidewalk. Keating's crew fought to get hoses close enough, but the pressure from inside kept forcing them back. When they finally broke through a side wall, the scene that greeted them defied comprehension. Tables were overturned, chairs melted into the floor, and bodies were stacked near every exit. Many were still upright, frozen in their final positions, overcome by carbon monoxide before the flames ever reached them. In the basement, rescue attempts turned into last acts of desperation. Firefighters smashed through the barred windows of the Melody Lounge, pulling out anyone they could reach. A soldier helped drag 2 women to safety, then went back inside and never returned. Above them, the ceiling of the main dining room collapsed, sending burning debris raining down. The smell of alcohol-fueled fire filled the air, mingled with the metallic tang of smoke. Witnesses said the noise was not a single explosion but 1,000 small ones, the sound of glassware, lamps, and human voices breaking together. Across the city, the alarms spread. Hospitals prepared for mass casualties, and doctors rushed from dinner tables to emergency rooms. At Boston City Hospital, staff cleared entire wards, knowing what was coming. The first ambulances arrived within minutes, sirens wailing, followed by private cars and taxis commandeered as makeshift hearses. The wounded were carried out wrapped in tablecloths, curtains, and coats. Nurses cut away burned clothing, their scissors sticking to melted fabric. Some victims were unrecognizable, their jewelry the only means of identification. By midnight, the fire was under control, but the devastation was beyond measure. Firemen continued to search the ruins, their boots sinking into the water and ash that covered the floor. Keating and his men found people who had died in each other's arms, some still seated, as if waiting for the music to start again. One couple was discovered near the bandstand, her hand clutching his tie, their faces inches apart. A waiter lay beside a tray of shattered glasses, his arm outstretched toward the door. Outside, snow began to fall lightly, turning the smoke into a grey mist that hovered over the ruins. Reporters and photographers crowded behind police lines, their flashbulbs capturing faces twisted in disbelief. Families arrived one after another, scanning the stretchers laid out on the pavement. Some found their loved ones alive, coughing and burned. Most did not. The morgues filled before dawn. Churches opened their doors to store bodies, each tagged with a number because names were too many to remember at once. In the early hours of November 29th, Boston became a city of whispers. Telephone lines jammed with calls. Radio stations broke into programming to update the death toll. Across America, soldiers' families waited for news, fearing their sons had perished not on the battlefield but in a nightclub back home. The morning newspapers carried headlines that seemed impossible: hundreds dead in Boston fire, wartime celebration turns to tragedy. When the smoke finally cleared, investigators entered what was left of the grove. The tropical paradise was unrecognizable, a skeleton of blackened beams and warped metal. They traced the fire's path from the basement lounge to the main floor, noting how quickly it had consumed the space. The satin palm fronds, treated with a cheap, flammable compound, had burned like gasoline. The false ceiling above them had trapped heat, turning the building into an oven. The revolving door, once a symbol of elegance, had become the club's tomb. As dawn broke, the city's leaders gathered at the site. Mayor Tobin stood in silence, his coat dusted with ash. "This," he said quietly, "should never have happened." But it had, and its aftermath would change everything about how America understood public safety. In the hours that followed, hospitals developed new techniques to treat burns, experimenting with early forms of penicillin and plasma transfusion. Yet for those who had been inside, no innovation could erase the memory of that night. Throughout the next day, bodies were laid in rows inside the armory, awaiting identification. Some families collapsed upon seeing their loved ones. Others searched for days, clinging to hope that someone had been miscounted. By Monday morning, the death toll reached 492. Most had died from smoke inhalation, others from the crush at the exits. It was said that more people had perished in 10 minutes at the Cocoanut Grove than in any fire in American history. In the following weeks, the Grove's ruins became a pilgrimage site. People left flowers, rosaries, and photographs along the sidewalk. Reporters described the faint smell of char that lingered in the air, refusing to fade. Survivors came in silence, some touching the walls, others staring at the ground. They spoke of guilt more than luck. Why them, and not the ones still inside? The official investigation would later confirm what many already knew: negligence and greed had conspired against the innocent. Locked exits, flammable decor, overcrowding, all sanctioned by an owner who believed himself untouchable. Yet behind every statistic was a story: the soldier who survived battle only to die a mile from home, the young couple celebrating an engagement, the waitress who had planned to quit that night. The fire did not discriminate. It consumed laughter, dreams, and futures with equal hunger. By the end of that winter, Boston rebuilt its confidence, but the shadow of the Cocoanut Grove never lifted entirely. For decades, firefighters who had been there avoided talking about it. Survivors carried the weight of what they saw to their graves. And though the city moved on, the memory of that night, when music turned to screams and light turned to ash, remained carved into its conscience. The Cocoanut Grove fire was not just an event. It was a moment when illusion met reality and lost. What began as a celebration of life became a study in how fragile that life can be when safety is ignored. Every locked door, every careless design choice, every moment of hesitation, each played its part in creating a tragedy that would echo through generations. For those who walked away, the sound of crackling fire never left their dreams. For those who died, the city built monuments and laws. But the true memorial lies in the awareness it left behind, that joy can vanish in a heartbeat, and that a single spark, left unchecked, can consume an entire world. In every tragedy, numbers dominate headlines, but faces carry the truth. The Cocoanut Grove fire was not just a list of the dead, it was a collision of human choices, mistakes, and courage. Behind the smoke and statistics stood three people whose lives embodied the moral dimensions of that night: the busboy who struck the match, the owner who locked the doors, and the nurse who refused to rest while hundreds burned. Stanley Tomaszewski was 17 years old, a quiet Polish-American boy working his second shift in the Melody Lounge. He earned barely $1 a night but was proud to help his family survive the war years. That night, his job was simple: replace burnt-out bulbs, carry drinks, clean tables. The fire began when he held a match to the dark corner where the light had gone out. In his testimony, he said he blew it out immediately, saw no flame, and went back to work. What he never knew was that a spark had caught the imitation palm frond above his head. By the time he turned back, the ceiling was glowing red. In the chaos that followed, Stanley helped guide people toward the stairway before being swept up in the crowd himself. He escaped through a broken window, his hair singed, his lungs scorched. When the city demanded someone to blame, it was his name they found easiest to curse. For years, he lived under the shadow of guilt, branded as the boy who burned Boston. It took an official investigation to clear him, but no verdict could erase what he carried inside. Every time he passed the site, he crossed the street, unwilling to face the ghosts that history had pinned to his name. The man who bore the true weight of responsibility was Barnett Wolanski, owner of the Cocoanut Grove. Wealthy, connected, and untouchable, Wolanski had built his empire on charm and arrogance. He was known to boast that no one could shut him down, not even the fire department. His club was his kingdom, glittering on the surface, rotten beneath. The exits were locked not from ignorance but intention. Wolanski feared theft more than tragedy. The revolving door at the entrance was meant to impress the city's elite. The hidden side exits, chained and concealed, were meant to control the common crowd. He prided himself on efficiency, not safety. When the fire broke out, Wolanski was at a hospital recovering from gallbladder surgery. He read about his empire's destruction from his hospital bed, refusing to believe the reports. By the time police arrived to question him, hundreds were dead. He insisted the fire was an act of fate. "If I could have been there," he told reporters, "none of this would have happened." Yet when the courts examined the evidence, fate had little to do with it. Wolanski was tried for manslaughter in a courtroom overflowing with grief and fury. Survivors testified about locked doors and black smoke. Firefighters described the blocked exits. He sat pale and silent as witnesses spoke of lost children and crushed bodies. In December 1943, he was found guilty and sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison. The newspapers called it justice, but his lawyer called it irony. Wolanski's health deteriorated behind bars, and 4 years later, he was released early by the governor he had once supported politically. He died not long after, a broken man in both body and spirit. Some said his release was mercy, others said it was unfinished punishment. History remembers him not for his wealth or connections, but for every life his negligence cost. When the victims began to arrive, she remembered the sound first, the endless sirens, then the groans echoing down the corridors. Hospitals were unprepared for that kind of disaster. Supplies ran out before dawn. Doctors cut away burned skin with razors sterilized in boiling water, while nurses used butter and olive oil on wounds when they had nothing else. Rita worked 3 days without sleep, moving from one patient to another, holding hands that trembled with pain. She wrapped faces in gauze until they were featureless, whispering comfort through layers of fabric. When one man begged her to find his wife, she wrote her name on his bandage so he wouldn't forget it. The next morning, she found his tag among the dead. Rita never sought recognition, but her name became a quiet legend among survivors. Decades later, some still remembered her voice more than the faces of their families. She embodied what humanity looked like in the ashes, tireless, gentle, defiant against despair. When reporters asked how she managed to keep working amid such horror, she answered simply, "Someone had to stay when everyone else was gone." 3 lives, each bound to that single night, reveal the full spectrum of human nature: innocence punished, power corrupted, and compassion enduring. Stanley's trembling hands, Wolanski's locked doors, and Rita's steady voice form the moral anatomy of the Cocoanut Grove. The boy carried guilt that was never his to bear, the owner carried arrogance that destroyed him, and the nurse carried empathy that outlived them all. Through them, the fire becomes more than a historical tragedy. It becomes a mirror reflecting what people choose to do when life tests their decency. Long after the flames were extinguished, these names lingered, spoken quietly in nursing homes, whispered in old firefighter reunions, mentioned in newspaper retrospectives marking each anniversary. The Cocoanut Grove was a place where greed, carelessness, and courage collided in the most human way possible. And though time has dimmed the photographs and erased the building itself, the stories of those 3 souls remain vivid reminders that behind every catastrophe are choices, and behind every statistic, a heartbeat that once hoped to see another dawn. The first hours after the fire were chaos layered over disbelief. Radio stations broke into regular programming with trembling voices, trying to describe what could not be described. Dispatchers stammered through crackling static as new calls came in faster than they could be answered. "Multiple casualties, unknown number trapped inside," one operator repeated, his voice flattening with exhaustion. The city's emergency network, built for small neighborhood blazes, was suddenly the center of a catastrophe. Sirens overlapped until the night itself seemed to scream. At Boston City Hospital, corridors became rivers of gurneys. Nurses waded through pools of melted snow and blood, cutting away burned fabric from skin that came off with it. Rita Gorrell and her colleagues worked under the harsh glow of surgical lamps that never dimmed for 3 straight days. Outside, ambulances lined up for blocks, their headlights vanishing into the smoke still drifting from the grove. The air smelled of alcohol, antiseptic, and despair. Reporters gathered on the hospital steps, their notebooks trembling in gloved hands. They counted bodies by the truckload. By dawn, every morgue in the city was full. "Boston's morgues overflowed," one journalist wrote. Hospitals used church pews as makeshift beds. Even that was not enough. Mayor Tobin arrived at the site just as firefighters were uncovering the last pockets of heat. His overcoat was dusted with ash. He had seen fires before, but not like this. "Dear God," he murmured, staring at the pile of shoes near the entrance. Hundreds of them, all shapes and sizes, the last trace of 1,000 evenings out. Around him, the street looked like a battlefield. Windows gaped like wounds. The palm tree decor hung in tatters. In the middle of the wreckage stood a piano, its keys melted into a single curved slab of ivory and ash. The smell of burned varnish mixed with something far worse. The morning papers turned the nation's eyes toward Boston. "Nightclub Inferno, hundreds dead," read the headlines. Yet words could not capture the sound of families gathering outside hospitals, whispering the same names over and over. Telephone lines jammed with desperate calls. Priests opened church doors to anyone seeking word of loved ones. Some walked the streets clutching photographs, stopping strangers in uniform to ask if they had seen a face that might already be gone. Inside the fire department headquarters, Chief Riley sat before a mountain of telegrams and reports. The death count climbed by the hour, 100, 200, 3. Each new figure felt impossible until it became true. By the second day, the number reached nearly 500. City Hall's telephones rang without pause. Reporters demanded explanations. Citizens demanded arrests. How, one headline asked, could a modern city burn alive in 20 minutes? When investigators reached the site, they moved carefully through the wreckage, their boots crunching on glass and bone. The walls were blistered, their colors erased. In the center of the main room, a line of bodies still lay as they had fallen, reaching for a door that never opened. Evidence of negligence was everywhere. Doors bolted from the inside, decorative fabric soaked in varnish, light switches fused to melted metal. The official statements would later call it a perfect storm of fatal conditions, but to those who stood there, it looked less like a storm and more like a crime scene. Public outrage ignited almost as fast as the fire itself. Crowds gathered outside City Hall demanding justice. Ministers preached sermons about greed and arrogance. Radio commentators accused the city of caring more about profits than people. Families of the victims wept openly on courthouse steps as names were read on the air. One broadcaster, his voice breaking, said, "Boston has become a city of funerals." By the third day, the hospitals were running on silence. The survivors no longer cried, they whispered. Doctors whispered to nurses, priests whispered last rites. The air was heavy with the smell of burnt skin and ether. Outside, snow fell again, clean and soft, covering the ruins like a shroud. Mayor Tobin returned to the site one last time, staring at the blackened sign that once glowed proudly above the door, Cocoanut Grove. His jaw tightened. "We will never let this happen again," he said quietly, though everyone around him knew the promise came too late. Across the nation, cities took note. Fire marshals rewrote safety codes, banning revolving doors as single exits, outlawing flammable materials, and mandating illuminated signs for every escape. But in Boston, progress offered little comfort. The wounds were too raw, the numbers too large. Every street seemed to echo with what had been lost, the laughter, the music, the ordinary night that turned extraordinary for all the wrong reasons. The fire was over, but the sound of it lingered, the roar of flames, the crackle of the radio, the hollow silence that followed. For those who lived through it, that sound would never fade. For Boston, it became the voice of its conscience, a reminder that negligence can roar louder than fire, and that sometimes, the worst disasters are the ones we allow to happen. The days following the Cocoanut Grove fire marked a transformation not just for Boston but for the nation. What began as a local tragedy became a defining moment in American history, altering medicine, law, and public safety forever. Beneath the grief, something irreversible was shifting, a recognition that what had happened could never be dismissed as fate. As the ashes cooled, investigators moved quickly. Evidence of locked doors, overcrowding, and illegal modifications filled their reports. It did not take long for attention to turn toward the man whose name had once been synonymous with glamour, Barnett Wolanski. Still confined to a hospital bed after surgery, Wolanski read the accusations in the morning papers, his empire reduced to a headline. Police officers arrived at his room to arrest him before he had even recovered from his wounds. The image of him, pale, gaunt, handcuffed against white sheets, became one of the most circulated photographs of the decade. To the public, it symbolized poetic justice. The man who had locked others in was now himself confined. His trial, held less than a year later, gripped the nation. Survivors testified about the jammed revolving door and the hidden exits. Fire experts explained how greed, negligence, and arrogance had turned a nightclub into a death trap. The jury deliberated for barely 4 hours before finding him guilty of manslaughter. When the sentence was read, 12 to 15 years in prison, there was applause in the courtroom. Justice, though delayed, had spoken. Yet even behind bars, Wolanski remained a figure of fascination, a reminder that privilege cannot always shield a man from consequence. He was released early due to failing health, dying soon after. For many, his death closed the legal chapter, but the moral reckoning had only begun. While courts sought accountability, doctors at Boston's hospitals were fighting a different battle, against infection, shock, and despair. Never before had they faced such an overwhelming number of burn victims at once. The wards were crowded with hundreds suffering injuries of unprecedented severity. Traditional treatments failed quickly. It was there, amid exhaustion and innovation, that modern burn medicine was born. Doctors began experimenting with new techniques. They used penicillin, still an experimental drug at the time, to fight infection and discovered its remarkable success. Surgeons practiced skin grafting on a scale never attempted before, transplanting healthy tissue from uninjured parts of the body to save lives once considered lost. Plasma transfusions became routine to stabilize patients in shock. The lessons learned from those nights changed medical practice worldwide. Boston, for a brief and terrible moment, became the center of progress born from pain. In the years that followed, hospitals across the country adopted burn units and protocols directly inspired by the Grove's victims. Out of the ashes of destruction came a revolution in healing. Meanwhile, public officials faced a different lesson, one of responsibility. The Cocoanut Grove exposed the fragility of American urban safety. Cities everywhere began re-examining their codes, realizing how easily spectacle could become tragedy. Within months, new national fire regulations were drafted. All exit doors in public venues were required to open outward. Revolving doors could no longer stand alone as main exits. Flammable decor was banned. Emergency lighting and clearly marked escape routes became mandatory. The word fireproof was no longer a boast. It became an obligation. The Grove's destruction had rewritten the relationship between entertainment and safety. No longer could beauty excuse danger, or success justify neglect. The fire that had taken nearly 500 lives forced America to see beyond its fascination with glamour. It demanded vigilance, empathy, and a respect for human life that could not be bought or ignored. Though decades have passed, every illuminated exit sign in a theater, every fire drill in a school, and every building inspection owes something to that night. The reforms were not just regulations, they were memorials carved into law, silent, glowing tributes to those who never made it out of the Cocoanut Grove. In the months that followed the Cocoanut Grove fire, Boston learned to live with silence. The smell of smoke lingered in the air long after the debris was cleared, a ghost that refused to fade. For a city built on pride and progress, the tragedy was more than a wound, it was a mirror reflecting everything it had ignored. The disaster forced Boston, and soon the entire nation, to confront an uncomfortable truth. Safety was not a privilege for the cautious but a responsibility for all. Within weeks, inspectors from across the country arrived to study what had gone wrong. They measured doorways, analyzed floor plans, and tested materials that had once been praised for their beauty. The findings were damning. Synthetic fabrics that had lined the club's walls were discovered to burn faster than paper. The grand revolving door, once the pride of the entrance, had turned into a trap. The investigation became a blueprint for reform. From coast to coast, cities rewrote their fire codes, creating standards that would change architecture forever. Every exit would now open outward. Every public space would be required to display illuminated exit signs. Flammable decorations were outlawed. Theaters, hotels, restaurants, none would operate without clear, accessible routes of escape. Boston's mayor, still haunted by the sight of charred shoes outside the club, personally signed new ordinances requiring regular inspections. He called it the city's second war effort, a battle not against a foreign enemy but against complacency. Fire marshals trained new generations of inspectors, treating safety as a science rather than an afterthought. Builders began designing with purpose, no longer seeing safety as an obstacle but as an integral part of beauty. Modern architecture absorbed the lessons of the Grove. Wide corridors, multiple exits, and non-flammable materials became symbols of civilization's progress. Yet laws and blueprints could not mend the deeper wounds, those carried by the survivors. Decades later, interviews revealed that many never escaped the fire entirely. Some still woke at night to the sound of phantom music turning into screams. A few survivors described being unable to enter theaters or elevators for the rest of their lives. One woman, burned across her arms and neck, said she wore long sleeves even in summer, not for vanity but for peace. Another man, a soldier who had survived combat in Europe, confessed that it was the nightclub, not the war, that haunted his dreams. Survivors formed quiet bonds, meeting in hospital corridors and church halls, bound together by an experience no one else could understand. Psychologists, still a new profession at the time, began studying the lingering trauma of those who had lived through the fire. The term survivor's guilt gained meaning from their stories. The Cocoanut Grove had produced not only medical and architectural reforms but also a new understanding of human psychology, the invisible burns left on the mind. Hospitals began including mental health support for victims of large-scale disasters, a practice that would eventually become standard worldwide. The influence of the Grove fire extended into medicine in ways no one could have predicted. The breakthroughs made in Boston's emergency rooms became foundational for modern trauma care. The systematic use of penicillin in burn treatment proved so successful that it accelerated its mass production during World War II, saving countless soldiers overseas. Doctors who had treated the Grove victims went on to pioneer new surgical methods, refining skin grafting and developing sterile techniques that are now routine. The tragedy became, in a grim sense, a classroom, a moment when necessity forced innovation. Out of horror came knowledge that would heal millions in the decades ahead. Architecture, too, was reborn. The aesthetic of safety, open spaces, visible exits, flame-resistant materials, became part of design philosophy. Universities began teaching fire science and emergency planning as essential disciplines. The once ignored details of air vents, stairwell widths, and door hinges became matters of national importance. Every public building constructed after 1943 bore the invisible signature of the Cocoanut Grove, a determination that beauty should never again come at the cost of human life. Still, memory refused to stay buried under progress. Each November, survivors and relatives returned to the site, standing in quiet reflection where the nightclub once glittered. They brought flowers, photographs, and the names of those who had not escaped. The original building was demolished, replaced by a parking lot and later by a medical facility, but the ground itself seemed to breathe history. Even in silence, it whispered the same question: what if? When documentaries revisited the event decades later, the faces of the survivors had aged, but their eyes still carried the same reflection of flame. Some smiled faintly, saying they had learned to forgive fate. Others could not. One woman, her voice trembling, said, "You can rebuild a city. You can change laws. But you never unhear the sound of people you couldn't save." The Cocoanut Grove fire left behind more than a memory of terror. It reshaped the conscience of a nation. From hospital wards to construction blueprints, its lessons became woven into daily life. Every glowing exit sign, every building inspection, every hospital burn unit carries its legacy. The tragedy taught that progress is not measured by luxury or profit but by empathy, by the invisible care built into walls and doors to protect those who will never know the price paid for their safety. The Grove burned for only a few minutes, but the light it cast on human responsibility still burns today, steady and unyielding, in every building that stands without fear. Time did not erase the fire, it merely softened its edges. For those who lived through it, the Cocoanut Grove never truly closed. It existed in the pauses between sirens, in the glow of every emergency exit, in the faint unease that stirred whenever a crowded room grew too warm. The tragedy became more than an event, it became a question that lingered in every corner of Boston. Who was truly to blame, and what debt could ever balance such loss? In the years after the final embers faded, the debate continued. Some insisted the fire was the result of one man's greed, a crime of arrogance committed by Barnett Wolanski, whose locked doors and decorative vanity turned beauty into death. Others argued it was the fault of the system that allowed him to do it, a network of inspectors, politicians, and businessmen who had looked the other way. There were even those who called it fate, a cruel convergence of chance and circumstance. Yet each explanation carried its own burden, and none could soothe the families who still set empty places at their tables every Thanksgiving. The site itself changed, but memory refused to yield. The ruins were cleared, and for a time a parking lot took their place, its grey concrete hiding the pain beneath. Then came a medical building, as if the city wanted to heal itself through science. But those who worked there swore that the ground never felt entirely still. Some nights, janitors claimed to hear distant music, the faint echo of a band warming up before the first dance. The stories were dismissed as superstition, yet the air around the block always seemed heavier, as if memory clung to the bricks. When survivors were interviewed decades later, their voices trembled not from age but from memory. One woman recalled the moment she realized her best friend was gone. She had turned to call her name and found only smoke. A firefighter, his eyes clouded with cataracts, still remembered the smell of burning silk and the sound of shoes slipping on melted floorboards. "You don't forget," he said softly. "You just learn to breathe around it." Their testimonies became a living archive, reminders that trauma does not die when the fire is out. The city, for all its reforms, never forgot either. Every anniversary, wreaths appeared quietly at the memorial plaque, often without names attached. Some were left by children who had grown up hearing only fragments of stories, others by old men in uniforms who no longer spoke. A few came from people who had no personal connection at all but felt the pull of a history that demanded remembrance. The plaque itself bore a simple inscription, a promise that what happened there would never happen again. Yet beneath that promise lingered an unspoken truth: remembrance is not enough unless it changes how people live. Historians and journalists returned to the Grove's legacy time and again, dissecting its failures and reforms, searching for closure that never came. Each generation seemed to rediscover the story as if for the first time, shocked by the idea that something so catastrophic could emerge from something as simple as a single spark. The fire became a cautionary tale taught in schools, a metaphor in sermons, a symbol in films. Its details blurred with time, but its essence remained, a reminder of how easily civilization can burn when vigilance falters. Still, there is another side to the story, one that refuses to end in despair. Out of its ashes rose not only stricter laws and better medicine, but also a deeper respect for the value of a single life. The doctors who treated the victims went on to teach generations of physicians. The engineers who studied the ruins designed safer buildings across the world. Even the families who lost everything turned grief into advocacy, insisting that tragedy should serve the living. Standing at the memorial today, the noise of the modern city hums around you. Traffic, laughter, footsteps, the sounds of life continuing. Few who pass know what happened there, but the ground remembers. It carries both warning and wisdom, whispering through time that negligence is the quietest form of violence, and remembrance is a duty, not a ritual. The Cocoanut Grove fire began with a flicker of light, but its shadow endures, not as darkness, but as a testament to the cost of forgetting and the fragile, enduring grace of those who remember.